Hello, today we will build this diorama. To begin with, we needed to make a base out of my favorite blue foam board. And this time the base will have an unusual shape, something resembling an artist's palette. I had to cut out two shapes because the diorama should be tall. And to glue two parts together, I am using very thin double-sided tape. Double-sided tape does its job perfectly, and now I need to remove all the excess and make the sides of the base smooth. This is a necessary step, as the sides of the base will need to be covered with thin wooden panel. This will make my diorama attractive and interesting. And of course, it will protect the sides of the diorama from any damage. So, after the third attempt, I managed to make such sides of the diorama. It turned out even better than I wanted. But as you can see, there is one problem. It was solved with the help of super glue and nails, and to make everything smooth, I used sandpaper. Well, it looks much better, but now I need to hide the nail marks. To do this, I mixed some plaster and applied it to the place that needed to be hidden. It doesn't look very good, but still better than it was. Now we can start changing the relief of the diorama. The first change will be adding a small trench to the diorama. My idea is that the tank arrived at a service location where the local tankers have a trench and a small dugout. I think such objects will look good on a military diorama. After I removed all the excess foam, it's time for careful work. I need carefully cut the wooden panel, so that it doesn't crack across the entire diorama. This time I showed all my patience and precision, and the result of the work was such a square hole in the diorama. Such changes in relief always make your diorama unusual and interesting. But now we need to leave the trench alone and focus on the dugout. And after I cut the space for it, it's time to focus on the details. And once again, I'll be using leftover plastic sprue from models to make imitation wooden logs out of them. I'll refine this method using pliers. Now you don't need a sewing knife to make such beautiful logs. It will be enough to take pliers and apply texture to the plastic rod. I will satisfy it with the result, but I need to make a lot of such logs for my trench, and after they are ready, glue them together to make a log wall. Such walls were used in trenches to prevent them from crumbling and to maintain their shape. But also it's worth noting that I am not making a combat trench, so the walls in it should look somewhat rough. After I tried them on, it seemed to me that one more detail was missing here, namely steps that soldier used to exit the trench. And I can say, remember, the more interesting details, the better your diorama. Great! Now it's time to work on trench arrangements. Since I plan to use epoxy resin to simulate water and puddles on my diorama, I came up with the idea of adding homemade shields made of planks to the trench, which soldier used to avoid walking through puddles in the trench. I also made the shield a bit rough. After all, don't forget that these are homemade devices, and they should convey some military carelessness. And as I think, it turned out just right. What do you think? Well, why you share your thoughts in the comments under this video? I'll be working on creating the dugout. This time I decided to use bamboo sticks. I have plenty of them and they are perfect for simulating the walls of the dugout. I just need to cut them to the required size, glue them together with super glue and treat the edges of the log with a lighter. And as you can see, there is nothing complicated here. And of course I made the roof for the dugout using the same method. This detail look very well. And that means it's time to move on to creating my favorite texture paste. As always, to create the texture paste I mix sand and plaster, then add PVA glue and make such a mixture. After that you need to leave the texture paste for a couple of minutes to make it thicker. Meanwhile, I decided to use one side of the diorama to create a crater filled with water in this place. Also, this detail creates balance on this diorama, as there is a trench hole on the opposite side. Now everything on the diorama is ready for applying the texture paste. And I must admit that this time I didn't do it the best way. and the necessary relief was slightly lost. But still, this homemade texture paste will do its job perfectly when it completely dries. Now I can start assembling the entire diorama. This needs to be done while the texture paste is still drying, as many objects needed to be integrated into this texture paste. And I decided to start with trenches. And how great it is that everything turned out exactly as I imagined. All I have to do is adjust the placement of the texture paste a bit, and all the trench details start to look cool. Also, on top of the logs I made a small parapet. I think this detail will add realism to these trenches. To distribute the texture paste a little bit, I used my finger, moistened with water. This way I can smooth out all the unevenness and show that the ground in this area has sunk a bit. Now I need to create a ladder. For this I'm using these plastic parts. This detail perfectly suits my scale and creates the effect I need, but first I need to cut it into a short piece. After that, all the pieces are installed in their places. To make them look more natural, I slightly embed them in the texture paste using my hobby knife. I'm sure this detail is absolutely necessary, and it fits perfectly into this diorama. All that's left to add to the trenches is the wooden shield that I made earlier. After that I can move on to working with the dugout. Here I had to spend more time, because I made a mistake when cutting out the space for the dugout. You can see how much texture paste spilled over, so I had to spend time correcting my mistakes. But in the end, the dugout turned out very well. Now I need to add texture paste to the roof. As in many wartime photos I used the reference soldier camouflage dugout roof with earth and grass. Over time, grass on the dugout roof would grow, thereby creating natural camouflage against enemy aircraft. To smooth out the texture, I once again used my finger. An indispensable tool, I must say. Well, jokes aside, because we are moving on to an unpleasant moment. Once again I decided to give self-hardening clay a chance, and once again it disappointed me by creating such ugly cracks on my diorama. It slightly ruined my plans. But once again my favorite texture paste comes to the rescue. I removed all the excess clay, then covered the surface with texture paste, and used thin cellophane to avoid dirtying the tank tracks. After a couple of minutes I got such a rot with the tank track. Yes, there are small problems, but they won't be noticeable because our tank will be glued in this spot. Now it's time to pay attention to various small details that will adorn this diorama. Such small detail as the wooden shield near the dugout, and also a small door with an iron handle will always be useful. Another additional detail is a chimney pipe, which I glued to the back of the dugout. Thanks to such detail you can show how soldiers arranged their lives during the war. Now this dugout definitely looks like a place where soldiers lived. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to work with detail printed on the 3D printer. For them I made a simple wooden pallet, and then glued several barrels and a couple of jerrycans to this pallet. This detail look pretty good, as I think. Also, this time I need to make up for it and finally make a decent tarpaulin. After all, in the previous video my tarpaulin looked awful. This time I used baking paper, and after thoroughly soaking it with PVA glue, I proceed to place the tarps on the diorama. I hung one tarpaulin on the dugout, as you may have already noticed. The second one is placed at the fuel depot, and the third one is hung on one of the logs in the trench. I think this detail, like the previous ones, will give my diorama more variety and more little stories. But still I felt like something was missing. In some places the thing looked very empty, so I decided that I needed to add some wooden planks that would be lead from the trench to the fuel depot. For example, soldiers used this plank to avoid sinking in the mud after rain, in case they needed to walk from the dugout to the fuel depot. There are many planks, but I think this is exactly the detail that was missing on my diorama. This time I had big problem with planting my 2mm grass, so I did it off camera. And after drying, I decided to immediately prime the diorama, to show you how all the details turn into a cohesive whole, becoming a beautiful diorama for our Sherman tank. Of course, often there are no problem with priming, and after it dried, I ended up with such a wonderful diorama. This time I managed not to overload this diorama with unnecessary detail, but still add interesting ones. Now I can fully move on to the painting stage. And as you may have noticed, off camera I experimented a bit with the color of the soil. First color which I used was flat earth, but unfortunately not all ready-made colors are universal. Sometimes it takes time to find the right color, so I had to repaint the already ugly grass several times. Now it has a lot of paint on it, but fortunately I managed to deal with this problem. I mixed Dectan color and Soviet World War II uniform color, and now my grass has such a subdued olive color, as after priming and applying the first layer of paint, it somehow became dull and didn't match the color of the tank at all. The second layer fixed this problem, and in my opinion it turned out quite well. Of course, I would still like to try hand and painting autumn grass, but apparently not this time. I think I simply lack the skill to understand everything correctly and avoid mistakes. Now I can move on to painting the ground. I need to remove the excessive saturation that remaining after my first attempt, and of course remove the excess olive color left by grass painting. And when the first layer has dried a bit, I start applying the second one. But this layer shouldn't cover the entire diorama, so I apply it in small dots across the entire territory of the diorama. This method will nicely diversify the color theme of the ground, and in combination with washing and highlighting, I will be able to achieve a wonderful result. Then I decided to work a little more on the grass. This is a necessary final touch that will give my grass volume and make its color more diverse. Also, painting the grass in this way will allow it to perfectly match my tank. Essentially, this is applying the dry brushing method to paint the tips of the grass in a lighter color, but the result of this work allowed me to somehow salvage this awful grass. I don't know what went wrong, but this time the grass on my diorama looked simply terrible, and I need to do something about it. But now it's time to correct the small mistakes I made while painting the grass. There aren't many of these mistakes, but those ugly olive spots on the texture of the ground completely ruin its appearance. Quickly dealing with this task, I armed myself with a colored German pale brown, and using the dry brushing method, applying highlights across the entire diorama. For some, using such a method may seem strange. For some, such an approach might seem unprofessional and rough. But listen, I like how this option looks on my diorama. So I believe it's the best option from all the ones I had in my knowledge base. And just look at this texture of the ground. Does it look awful? I'm sure it doesn't. Right now my diorama look like large path of land not far from the forest, where the ground often mixes with clay. In my opinion, it looked quite natural and very pleasant. It's time to move on and paint in the wooden detail. First, I paint all the wooden planks with a combination of Dectan and German pale brown. I need to achieve the effect of wooden painted with white paint. Why exactly like this? Because the soldier took this plank from local farm, where many wooden parts were painted white. That's a simple explanation. The next step in painting this detail involved using the dry brushing method, but with heavily diluted paint to create a unique dirt effect on the planks. Then, to make planks even older and dirtier, I applied a light color over them. But this time I don't paint the planks in the usual way. Instead, I create a kind of matte spots by randomly dabbing with a brush across the surface of the planks. Now I needed to let the planks dry and shift my focus to the logs. This time I am painting them in a very simple way. I use Dectan and chocolate brown to achieve a light brown color. Then I simply apply the dry brushing technique and get the result you see here. For additional detailing, I use the same color that was used for the grass, to create a moss effect on the logs. This effect looks quite natural here, as there will constantly be moisture in the trenches, meaning there is elevated humidity. I also decided not to spend too much effort on painting the fuel cans. They printed well. On the American fuel can, you can even see the later indications that it contained gasoline. But it seems to me that in this situation the dry brushing method is sufficient for painting this detail. And for Jerrycan I choose the same color as for the grass. Of course it's up to you to judge, but I believe that this detail is not particularly important, so spending a lot of time on its painting doesn't make much sense. The same goes for the barrels. And actually the barrels didn't turn out very well and require a lot of processing. So it's time for me to move on and work on painting various clothes and tarps that I scattered around the diorama. As you can see, I'm painting the first tarp in red. I thought this color would create the necessary contrast. The tarp on the dugout was decided to be painted in green. For example, soldier uses tarp for camouflaging vehicle or fuel depots, and green is just the perfect color for such purpose. The tarp in that range was quickly painted in a dirty blue color. And just look at this diorama. There are only few details left and it will be fully ready. First I decided to work on enhancing the tarps, so I added some wear and tear on the edges and folds of the tarps to make them look more diverse but not overly attention-grabbing. I also painted the chimney coming out of the dugout. I started by applying the dark crust color, then simply darkened it with heavily diluted chocolate brown. Now it's time to apply wash. This time I made a combination of two oil paints, my favorite Van Dyke Brown and Lamp Black, which created an excellent wash. Now I need to apply it to all areas of interest on this diorama. And of course, many viewers, it may seem like I am just doing something incomprehensible with this diorama. But just look at this diorama after it dries. Look at all this artificial shadow created by the dark wash. I think it's wonderful and only complements the diorama rather than spoiling it. In any case, now the diorama perfectly matched my tank. And that means we can move closer to the final stage of working with the diorama. The first such stage is preparing the epoxy resin. Here it's the same as with any epoxy. 2 parts of epoxy resin and 1 part hardening are mixed together. And I add a drop of flat earth and Soviet World War II uniform color to give the water a dirty swamp color. And now I need to carefully mix all this mixture using a stick. Remember that epoxy resin should not to be vigorously stirred or shaken. Such treatment of this material can lead to appearance of bubbles, which is clearly not what you expect from your epoxy resin. To ensure that my resin stays in this pit and doesn't leak out, I decided to glue a piece of thin plastic with super glue. Additionally, I sealed it with masking tape. Now, using a bamboo stick, I carefully pour the epoxy resin into a prepared funnel. I had some bubble, but they were easily removed with a modeling knife. This thing you can do with any sharp object. In other areas of the diorama, epoxy resin was added using a bamboo stick. And don't worry if you think I added too much epoxy resin in places where it probably shouldn't be. I did it on purpose because I want to show you how to remove epoxy resin if you accidentally spill it. For the same purpose I used epoxy resin to the top of the diorama. To remove excess epoxy resin, I use simple cotton swabs. They absorb fresh epoxy resin excellently and almost completely remove it from your diorama. Of course, the shine from epoxy resin will remain on the diorama, but we'll deal with this issue a little later. Now I need to wait 24 hours for epoxy resin to cure properly. And here is what I got after it hardened. This resin looked good actually, although it leaked a little through the superglue. That's why you should use masking tape. This method can save your diorama from epoxy resin leaks. But before continuing to work on the diorama filled funnel, I decided to repaint the area where too much epoxy resin spilled. A bit of a color I used for painting the ground, as well as matte varnish, did an excellent job, and there is almost no trace of epoxy resin left. Dealing with the epoxy puddle issue was more challenging. The resin looked very uneven, so I had to cut out a huge piece. Then I had to sand this area. And here's what I got. I think it's much better than it was before. And the final step was painting the figures. And if you need complete video about how I paint in 1/72 scale figures like that, just ask about this in comment section under this video. And that's all, dear viewers. This unusual diorama is ready. Everything on it look wonderful. And this little bottle of epoxy resin adds a certain charm to the diorama. I hope you enjoyed watching this video and, of course, learning something new. With that, I bid you farewell. Don't be afraid to experiment with UniModels and dioramas. After all, that's the essence of our hobby. We should enjoy what we do and not limit ourselves. With you as always was Vlad from the No Quality Diorama channel, sending you virtual hugs because a little warmth never hurts in this difficult time.